All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. I know it is late local time. So, for those of you who are local and not international, thank you so much for sticking around to the end of the day. uh, I am very excited to be presenting to you all the way from Washington, D.C. When I first submitted this presentation, I came up with the title Why and How My SharePoint 2013 Information Architecture Needs to be Redesigned for the Future. And as I started writing the presentation, the content was right, but I realized the subject was wrong. So I simplified it a little bit. Why my old IA stinks for modern SharePoint and how to fix it. Hopefully by the end of this, you have an idea of where I'm coming from and why this is important. And if you do, feel free to reach out to me. A little bit about me. You've got my video on, and by the way, feel free to turn your video on so that I can see your faces when I do poorly, and I know I'm hitting or not hitting the right marks there. Um, uh, this is a little bit about me. So I work for AvePoint Public Sector here in Washington, D.C. Most of my customers are U.S. government facing. And we are actually very much behind the times on from an adoption perspective of modern technology. In the last 3 years, the federal civilian agencies have started adopting cloud. In the last year, the defense organizations have started to have those conversations. We have a migration practice at AvePoint, and we are seeing a lot of migrations from 2007 and 2010 into either 2016 or in some cases SharePoint Online, especially as SharePoint Online becomes more and more acceptable and agencies get their authority to operate. But so it's been an interesting few years for me as our customers are starting to catch up with the commercial space. Also, if you like what I'm talking about today and you want to hear more, onthespot.tech is where I have my two podcasts. Buzzkill is an information technology podcast focused on the softer skills like change management, communications, customer engagement. On the Spot, This Week in Teams is our Microsoft Teams podcast focused on the Teams platform and related technologies. Each of those have probably 2 to 4 episodes a month where we bring out, hopefully we have speakers and such, and we have conversations just like this. Today's goals, I have 3. I'm going to give you an excruciatingly selective history of SharePoint, specifically with relation to information architecture. Some of the slides on that history is going to be very quick, and some of them I'll dig in a little bit deeper. I'm then going to go into what the problem is I'm talking about, nested site infrastructure, and how that causes problems with the modern technologies. And lastly, I'm going to give you our approach to information architecture with our customers. It may or may not be the right approach. I certainly welcome your comments, questions, and feedback as we go through it. If you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. The way my microphone sits, it covers the chat, but I will check it every once in a while. And of course, I'll try to have time at the end to do so as well. So let's start with that excruciatingly selective SharePoint history. And I know I probably start out with a faux pas by talking about SharePoint 2001 and not necessarily the predecessor capabilities with Content Management Server. But the idea is we are dealing with a platform that is almost 20 years old, or 20 years old, depending on how you count it, maybe dev time. In 20 years, not only has technology changed a lot, but how technology serves the business has changed a lot. And if we have not reconsidered how we are approaching information architecture to take that technology and provide solutions to the business, then we are no better than 20-year-old technology. So that's something to consider as you're going through this. As I skip through the history and move into SharePoint 2003, you'll notice I'm not really talking about the capabilities that were available early on. Yes, we had file share connected, a user interface to give you access to your files. We started to introduce things like content channels and a news site, but ultimately we didn't really have necessarily a solution that required a deep IA, that required thinking about business solutions. We were just trying to put something out there to improve what was collaboration of the day. It wasn't really until 2007 that SharePoint was necessarily accepted as an enterprise solution. It brought together the old code bases. It enhanced a lot of the capabilities, and it gave us what was really a solid intranet for the first time. In my personal opinion, though, we missed the mark because what we had was a technology solution being installed to provide business capabilities, but not solve business problems. It really, the technology could solve them. It's one of the reasons I fell in love with SharePoint as a platform. It is one of the reasons why it became so successful. But also a lot of organizations who installed SharePoint and then walked away from their end users found that the success ratio was not what they were expecting. The adoption to the tool, the platform, etc. What they would do, and this is the part that nowadays doesn't work, is they would set up a site collection and then they would find a local administrator and say, you own this site collection. Do anything you want to it. Create subsites, create document libraries. You can control everything here. If you need anything outside of this container, that's where our farm administrators come in. And that's where the enterprise architecture comes into play, is outside of your container. But inside your container, no problem, do what you want. There were some very successful environments, very successful site collections and business solutions. But overall, what we ended up with was a document repository that was not well architected from an information perspective and very hard to find what we were looking for. Now, 2010 came along and there was a lot of excitement on the IT side. It allowed for custom development. It really enabled organizations to develop solutions on the SharePoint platform. It also started the change of the UI. We saw the first multi-tenant capabilities show up. We saw that Microsoft recognized search was a problem as they integrated fast search as an option. But the question became with 2010, and from a business perspective, for me, it really wasn't that exciting. It was just more of the same, some IT things, but from an end user perspective, I didn't really see a lot of change. The ribbon showed up, that came, and that was actually kind of frustrating at first for business users. 2013 came around, and this is where we saw an enterprise platform actually start to get that enterprise mindset. Fast search and that improved search experience was now native. Templates were streamlined, distributed cache, and a new workflow engine were introduced. And so the capabilities for SharePoint had drastically increased. Top that off, the UI was pulled down. The new UI was introduced from Office 365 or from SharePoint Online. And that's actually what the screenshot here is. It was that first time we were starting to bring those user interfaces down from the cloud. It was much more clean. It was much more modern. The ability to drag and drop files between your desktop and the website were there. So the end users were actually starting to get excited about the interface again. And that software as a service model from SharePoint, it changed things. Microsoft knew that for software as a service to be successful, you had to ensure customers took a similar approach to the tool. So the custom development that they introduced in 2010, the future of that became very in question. Lots of customers hesitated to adopt 2013 because of that. In fact, we were told that 2013 may very well be the last server instance of SharePoint that existed. And so there was a lot of question as to, how can we be successful? So while 2013 brought us the question of how do we support multi-tenant tools within our server farm, it wasn't as well adopted, and therefore it wasn't really something that we were starting to approach from a reconsideration perspective. And what I mean by that is the common information architecture to this point was very much a nested infrastructure. From 2013 all the way back, it was, we had our web farm, our web app on the farm. We had our main site collections. Underneath those, we had some subsites, and 3, 5, 10, 15 subsites down, we had this infrastructure that many people didn't know how to navigate. Search was terrible because it couldn't crawl successfully all of that data. It's not that it didn't have the capability of crawling the data, but trying to get through that nested infrastructure and trying to be able to navigate through that became very difficult. Broken inheritance happened all the time. A sub-site would get created by a site collection administrator who had basic understanding. The sub-site would get created, permissions would be given to somebody, and the next thing you knew, this SCA was removed from the sub-site. They didn't even know it existed. And then they'd get added 3 levels down, and now we have this orphan sub-site that nobody understood how to get to. So it had a lot of problems in how we were using it. And to date, it was allowed. So we didn't really revisit it. In fact, many of my DoD customers, they created organizational sites. You had the J6, and underneath the J6, you had the J62 subsite, and underneath that, you had subsite after subsite. And in an organization like the DoD, where there are lots of reorganizations, every time a reorg happened, we had to move the entire subsite. And if we were just pulling a subsite out, leaving the children and parents together, it was a complete migration jumble of a cluster. Let's call it a cluster. I'm trying to think of the right word to use here in a recording, right? With the cloud, though, we saw a much cleaner setup. You had your tenant, and within your tenant, you had your site collections, and within your site collections, you had your content. There were some questions about navigation early on. How do we navigate between things? How do we relate content from one site collection to another? And so that early cloud was definitely problematic from that perspective. And on top of that, we also saw very quickly that top level management infrastructure got crowded and hard to understand. So there are problems, especially early on with the flat infrastructure, but that's another conversation for another presentation. Today, what I want to focus on is the importance of that infrastructure and why the nested sites cause problems with modern collaboration. So between 2013 and 16, we had that conversation of, is SharePoint Server going away in favor of the cloud? Anyway, who needs their own on-premises version? Thankfully, 2016 came around and they brought us the hybrid approach. It allowed on-prem farms to connect to SharePoint Online. There was some search connectivity there, which was, it had its questionable interfaces, but it was there. The ability to figure out where documents would go for OneDrive, where profile information was stored. There was that start to the conversation. And SharePoint mobile interface became almost acceptable, definitely better than anything we had previously. To support this, though, not the mobile interface, but all of the changes that were happening, there were some key changes on how Microsoft managed security, compliance, and governance. And this is where we started to first see the issues with our very nested world. For example, Office 365 DLP was brought from SharePoint Online into SharePoint Server. Can you imagine trying to manage DLP 17 layers down in a nested SharePoint site environment with broken inheritance and orphan sites? Like you being able to control that as an administrator and making sure it's working and report on that became a nightmare. So in 2016, we saw that push from Microsoft. You have to flatten your architecture. Now, I know people who haven't, and I'll get to that. But generally speaking, as a rule, not as a requirement, but as a general model, there is that push to flatten your architecture. Now, with that flat architecture, broken inheritance became less of an issue. Governance was able to moved up to the site collection level. And organizational restructuring meant, hey, go right ahead. I don't have to restructure my content, just my links. So it became a different conversation, almost easier to manage from a content perspective, a little bit harder to manage from a site collection to site collection perspective. Now, 2019 really pulled heavily on the cloud. If you recall, Microsoft is investing heavily in SharePoint Online, new features, new security, all rolling out at a pace that's left SharePoint Server way behind. So while SaaS users, software as a service users, have been using modern SharePoint for a couple of years, SharePoint 2019 is the first time on-prem farms are really being introduced to it. With that comes hub sites and communication sites. They're all the rage. And with those, the content roll-up web parts, bringing you your intranet news, not just from this site, but from multiple sites. So that first question of how do I connect relatively site collections that are related to each other fall into that hub conversation. Now I'm at a developer conference mostly, right? So let's talk about that. Imagine your project manager comes over to you and says, I need you to create a content roll-up web part. The content should come from this site collection, but also all of the nested subsites. Let's throw the level of 17 nested subsites in. And then in addition to that, also this site collection over there that's not part of this nested structure, we need to pull that in too. I was a developer once. Anything's possible. You give me enough time, money, I can develop whatever you need me to develop, but I'm not looking forward to those requirements. It's possible, but it's not a task I want to take on. And Microsoft recognized that. And so the flatter structure, the hub connectivity, the way those roll-ups pull content in, it became much easier to pull that together from consider an intranet perspective, right? Now we're cruising through, we're about 15 to 20 minutes in. Let's kind of summarize the importance that we're talking about. So tenant-wide settings at a sub-site level, you don't have the level of control that you do at the site collection or tenant level. Records management, those are site collection things. Taxonomy, site collection things. Navigation, global elements. Governance and lifecycle management, those things happen at the site collection. These are the way native infrastructure or native controls work for SharePoint, for Office 365 and SharePoint on premises. From an application perspective, when you create a new SharePoint site as a user, the default site that's created is a site collection. If you create a communications site, you can't have subsites. It doesn't work that way. You have to use hubs and site collection level controls. If you're talking about Office 365 and you're looking at the applications and how they interact with SharePoint, group and team connected sites, they create their own site collections. And let's not even dig deeply into the private channel conversation from Teams, where every private channel is its own site collection. If you are still thinking about your information architecture at the site and sub-site level, then being able to integrate any of these things into that IA is going to take a lot of work. Going through again, controls are by the site collection. The group membership, you have one group, it is the membership for your entire site collection. Your expiration and naming conventions natively are at that level. And then from a UI perspective, I talked about hubs and content rollups. Modern sites do not like subsites. It's just the way they're developed and the way their web parts work. And like I said, organizational change happens all the time. It's not just in the DoD. There are mergers and acquisitions. There are restructures. I was an employee of a 25,000 person firm when we completely restructured, going from a capability organization to a market organization. And when we did that, all of the content had to be reorganized. In a flat infrastructure, you have to change your pointers, but you don't have to do a full content migration. So this is some stuff that you should be considering in some of the problems that you may face. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to give you an approach to information architecture. Hopefully, I've whet your appetite on why it's important to reconsider your information architecture. And if not, I would love to get into a deeper conversation on any of those items. You can hit me up on Twitter, and I'll gladly help. I'll gladly, have that conversation with you. What I've got here though is that information architecture conversation, and really, I'm going to throw a little governance in. because without proper governance, your information architecture is very short term. It is not something it's not something that's going to work for your end users. So we'll get to some of those points there. I'm going to start with this quote from Gartner. Gartner, for those of you who are not aware, Gartner is a research and market research organization. They evaluate technology and provide write-ups on how technology supports needs and requirements and which technology is better. They had this quote about SharePoint back in 2013, and I stand by this. The problem with SharePoint are not technological shortcomings. The problem most often with SharePoint comes down to planning. It comes down to, how do we roll this tool out? How does it support the end user and the business and the mission? And how do we manage that over time? That's the big one. Is I often saw IT organizations stand up SharePoint, give site collection administration capabilities to a few people, and then walk away. And when you do that, that long-term success of the tool, you're going to get a very quick adoption and then a very quick drop-off as people realize that the way the tool works doesn't meet their need, or they don't understand how it meets their need. And so the tool itself fails because we don't prepare our users for using it. Now, I'm definitely going to acknowledge, and I said this once before, not everybody's SharePoint maturity level is the same. And not everybody's desire for SharePoint is the same. So if you have a very immature immature SharePoint implementation, you're focused on that bottom left corner, mostly content dumping, then considerations for information architecture may not be as important to you. You may not need to dig and invest as deeply as I'm going to describe in the next handful of slides. On the other hand, if you are leaning towards the right side of this slide, if you want SharePoint and Office 365 or Microsoft 365 platform to be your enterprise knowledge management and collaboration solution, then you really do need to consider, how do we manage our information? How do we architect and design it so that users can get what they need quickly and easily? So depending on where you are left to right on this, it really will help you understand how much the next slides affect you. So when I sit down with customers to talk about information architecture and information management, we go through, and you'll see Office 365 a lot here. This works for 2016. This works for 2019. This works for SharePoint Online. These are all very common conversations that we have. There are conversations about how Office 365 is treated, for example. If you are an on-premise organization moving into the cloud, then I would bet that your Exchange administrators, your SharePoint administrators, your identity management administrators, they are not working together at first. They are not working together or thinking about working together in Office 365. Now, as your organization matures and you start to see the interconnectivity of the tool set, you realize that, hey, this is a collection of different services that all work together, which means I need, whether the organizational management structure of my company fits this, I need those people to be working together. I need there to be some form of a board that approves changes, because if you change the naming convention in Teams, it affects the name of SharePoint site collections. And if my teams and SharePoint administrators aren't working together, then I'm not going to have a properly named set of workspaces. And generally, what I heard early on is Teams was owned by the Exchange team or the team that owned Skype for Business, because that's the first use for it, either groups or communications through replacing Skype. And they're not thinking about what SharePoint users or the SharePoint admins need. So that collection of services that need to work together, knowing who owns these things, knowing that this is not just a technology implementation, But this is designed for mission success, which means that we have to be talking to the business owners to understand how are they doing how do they need to do what they need to do, and what kind of roadblocks are they coming across. So these are the kinds of conversations that we're having with people. You can't just put the tool up on the side of the road and hope it's going to work the way you want it to work. You actually have to, you have to stand up your bus stops and let people know this is where you stop for this. This is where you stop for that. You've got to explain the technologies. Like if you're in the commercial space, you have access to Yammer and Teams. Which one do you use and why? Or one of my favorites is, well, what's the difference between OneDrive and SharePoint? That's a long conversation, or at least clarifying that is a long conversation. But having those guideposts is part of being successful with a tool like Microsoft 365. And frankly, with SharePoint on premises, it's much more than just a file share now. You have to explain to people how to use it, why to use it, and you have to work with them to understand what do they need to be successful. Now, when we talk about information architecture specifically, there's a couple of different perspectives that I focus on. On the left-hand side with our boxes, we take it from a technology perspective. What kind of organizational structures do we have around our data? And most commonly, we're talking about nested folder when we first have this conversation with people. But we're trying to figure out, like, when we organize our data, what type of organization is it? Functional? Is it organizational? So, department based. And then what kind of labels do we have to represent our data? And labeling schemas in the file shares didn't exist. So as we're converting people from file shares to SharePoint, we have to help them understand what are the values of those labeling schemas and why do I even care about that? From a navigational perspective, and this is one of the more interesting conversations, how do people browse my information? Now, this is an interesting one for me because the discussion when we start talking about navigation generally leads itself to a logical versus a physical organization. And I've been having that conversation for 8 or 9 years now. Your logical navigation does not have to match your physical navigation. And in fact, in SharePoint Online, it can't most often, because physically you have very flat site collections. And if that were your navigational navigation, no one would know where to click. Traditionally, navigation was the physical sub-site organization, and that's why it was so popular. When you nested that infrastructure, though, like I talked about, if you have the billing department 3 levels down under finance and billing needs to move to accounting, you're now talking about a content reorganization. You're now talking about migrating content, migrating permissions, making sure that the right people know where this change happened and how to browse to it. And so that physical layout is generally not a good way to build your architecture. It's a good way to consider how do we navigate things, but they don't need to match. And I think I may have stuttered my way through that to be a little confusing. Lastly, that search side is how do the end users get to the content? They can browse to it or they can search for it. And if I'm thinking about my information architecture, if I'm thinking about labeling schemas, I need to be thinking about how that affects search. And with modern search, it does. So knowing how to modify search to work from that information architecture we're designing is key from a technological perspective. Now, the circles are my business side. And from a business perspective, there's context, content, and users. Context are, what are my goals? How are things funded? What are the political structures? What's the culture? What kind of constraints are there to my information architecture that I have to consider? In the US government space, context may include regulation on how data has to be accessible or not accessible, on how records need to be stored, for how long, and what happens with them when that period of time has ended. Content objectives, looking at documents and data types, thinking about how much content we have and what structures exist today and where I want them to be tomorrow. And of course, the governance and ownership. Who owns this content? Does the person who created the site own the content, or does it roll up to somebody else? And speaking of people, the users, the audience of that content. What do they need from that content? What kind of behaviors are they going to have around it? And what's the experience they're looking for? These are the things, the questions we need to be thinking about and asking ourselves while we're trying to decide how do we organize our content. Now, what we do with our customers is we walk them through this exercise of understanding the types of workspaces we're going to need. If you think back to all those questions we were just talking about, they all lead in this direction. Do I need team spaces? Think about that as your departments. Do I need project spaces? If I'm going to have a dynamic group that has a specific beginning date and end date, it's going to change users. It's going to cross multiple departments. I need to bring in a designer for a little while. Well, the designer doesn't belong to my team, so I have to think about what that means. And then, of course, communities. When I worked for that 25,000 person systems integrator, we had communities of practice. And I helped work with the SharePoint community of practice, bringing together over 1,000 individuals from all over the firm. Well, what did that mean for us? What did we need to be successful? We needed to share documents with each other. We needed to have regular virtual meetings because we were spread out all across the globe. We needed to be able to share the recordings from those meetings. And where did we share them? These are the types of things that help organizations define what types of workspaces we need. So don't just think about the department infrastructure. Think about function. Think about the logical use of those spaces. And as you do that, then you can, as you start to map the types of workspaces, the type of data that's going to be there, you can start to figure out what technologies exist to support that. With Office 365, we saw the public sites go away, but we still have extranet sites where we allow guest users into our teams, or we have external access or external sharing with SharePoint. So there are different ways that you're going to interact, and being able to define this is integral in being able to organize that content. Now, we did this exercise with one of our international customers, and they came up with 9 primary spaces that they were able to design their information architecture around. And knowing those types of spaces, they knew how they fit into the navigation. They knew that, some things needed to roll up to that global navigation while some things didn't. And they were able to have those conversations to figure that out. Now, as you're doing that, as you're identifying your workspaces, you need to start thinking about what strategies do we have for different types of information. So at the bottom of this pyramid, which, by the way, if you've been around SharePoint for a while, other than the color scheme, which I changed to match the branding for the conference, you may recognize this pyramid. This has been around since the early 2007 days. That concept of personal spaces to intranet spaces, and knowing that being able to organize or define these helped you understand the level of governance and the level of control you needed around them. So at the top of the pyramid, the intranet, the corporate portal, that's probably going to have very strict controls. Who can change the content in it? When can they change it? What can they do with it? How is it organized? Whereas if you go down to projects and teams in the middle there, you're likely to have a looser level of control. Perhaps how you provision is still strictly controlled, and how you have life cycle around it, but what you do within it might be more open. And then the personal spaces, the OneDrives, the MySites back in the day, those are generally unstructured. Now, you may have some rules, like you can't have PII in a OneDrive, or you can't have confidential data there, or you can't share with external users perhaps. But the amount of control, the amount of rules at that level generally ends up being much less restricted. Now, if you take those 4 categories and put them across the top here, you can match the categories of your workspaces with the information on the left. So from a service description, what is a team space versus a project space? From a functionality perspective, a service functionality perspective, what does an intranet site require versus a project space versus a personal space? What tools and capabilities, what SLAs need to be there? Defining like this allows you to very easily document for your end users, for your business, how your collaboration system and the information architecture of that collaboration system works. We also often take our customers through a mapping exercise similar to this. You can see again those 4 categories across the top. Down the left-hand side are potential workspace types. The personal space being OneDrive, so we'll just go ahead and pull our personal space into there. The SharePoint system being crossing both the project and team space and into the intranet, of course. So, and then Teams and possibly even Yammer, which I don't have on this graphic, supporting it. Now, let's go ahead and pull a few things over. So we know our intranet portal goes into the publishing space. We're probably going to use modern communication sites for most of that, maybe some modern team sites for some of the more collaborative spaces in it. We are going to go ahead and populate a few team spaces, those department spaces for marketing and finance. Within marketing, we're going to create a project space called brand campaign. And actually, I would argue that I didn't do this graphic correctly because all of those are probably a combination of Teams and SharePoint, right? So being able to pull this up with one of our customers and drag the different types of workspaces around gives them that real understanding of how is this going to work. So we put this up on a board, either a whiteboard or back in the day, we've used big foam core boards. And our workspaces are Post-it notes, which if I had one here, I'd pull it up just for fun. We put every workspace gets a Post-it note and we start putting them around. So, the CEO's OneDrive, well, that's pretty obvious where that goes. And we go through it from that perspective. And as you continue through the exercise, you can see where some things cross the boundaries, where we can start to identify things with these red lines, which are things that have external access to them. And this allows you to start seeing the logical architecture or the physical layout of your workspaces, which help draw to the information architecture of it all. So this kind of exercise we found very successful with our customers to help them understand what they can expect from their collaboration space. Now, once we've gone through all that, we've helped them to understand what type of workspaces do we need, what type of information is in there. I may have forgotten one of my slides in here too, didn't I? The other thing we need to consider is how does that all relate to each other? I've talked about navigation. I've talked about the fact that your physical structure doesn't have to match your navigational structure. I had a slide, and it looks like I might have deleted it there, but I had a slide in there that showed for AvePoint, our intranet, our global navigation is not at all the way the SharePoint sites are laid out. In fact, the global navigation generally goes to hubs, which then goes to the department sites underneath the hubs, or the hub for HR, where there's different sites for different regions. So that navigation can pull from this, but it isn't going to match what you do here. And I think that's what this exercise helps to show you, is it helps to show you the fact that you can't just do a physical structure. You have to consider how to connect things like that. Now, to have a successful information architecture, you also have to approach the governance and understand that having a governance strategy is valuable. A governance document, for example, tells people what services are supported by my organization. It tells people how does the navigation work. It tells people who owns the process. So if I have a question or concern, I can reach out to them. It also helps to provide a common understanding. It defines the vocabulary we're going to use so that I understand when I ask for a workspace for a project, I understand what I'm going to get and what that means and what kind of life cycle goes around that. It helps me understand how are records handled in this infrastructure, what labels are automatically placed versus things I need to control. And why is it important for you to understand what my project end date is? Well, if the governance plan says that a project, a workspace goes for lifecycle management when the project ends, end users begin to understand all of the connectivity there. From a governance perspective, I want to be very clear that I'm not just talking about service governance. I'm not talking about governance of Teams and governance of SharePoint. I am talking about governance, or governance has to connect larger than that. So there's the service governance here at the bottom. That rolls up to IT governance. It begins to help you understand the requirements of IT. And this is big when I was talking about Teams versus SharePoint versus Exchange. And if I have a Teams governance plan and SharePoint has a SharePoint governance plan, well, hopefully they roll up some way, shape, or form to an IT governance strategy so that we have potential interconnectivity between our plans. Once we go past the IT governance and look at corporate governance, we can understand how does the relationship of our workspaces work with the way the organization is going to grow and change over time. And as you start to see the connectivity there, you start to realize that governance and information architecture are not one-time things. You have to revisit them from time to time. You have to have a process for modifying them. Because if you tie governance up to the corporate strategy, or you tie information architecture up to the organizational architecture, you start to see changes up here at the organizational level and the corporate level will affect the tool itself. And we have to have plans for all of that. I mentioned that a comprehensive governance plan, it provides definition. It balances the business need with the technological capability. It must be as simple as is appropriate so that it is informative. If you hand somebody a 100-page governance plan, you better be prepared for them to gloss over and not pay attention. And you also have to understand that it is a living document. It is something that people have to have access to and be able to change as the organization changes. You generally want to start with a mission. What is the technology? How are we supposed to use it? Define who the sponsors and champions are. And if you don't know what a champion is, go look up the champions program that Microsoft helps to define for their platforms. Champions are amazing resources for organizations, for IT organizations, because they reach outside of IT and they start to give you the ability to interact with other users to understand their need. And it gives you cheerleaders. And then it also, the mission should look at what are the objectives? What are the benefits to the organization? So as you go through there, you want to reduce information silos. You want to provide tools for the business to work. You want to facilitate sharing. And then the objective statement can help answer things like what applications or what can the business run? What applications can they run? Who manages and owns them? Are we allowed to have records in here? Permanent records? Do they need to be moved if they get identified as permanent? We have one customer who in Office 365, Teams is defined as a temporary service. They don't set up a team for a department. They set up teams for projects. Well, that means if a record appears in a temporary workspace, we have to move it. because it may have 25-year retention while the workspace lifecycle ends after 2 or 3 years. And you can't delete a workspace that has a permanent record in it, so you have to move the record to another storage area. So these are the kinds of things that get defined as you start to express what are the missions and what are the objectives. And then just to kind of wrap it all up, and this is one of my favorite pictures of all time, and I recognize it's probably doctored, but that doesn't change anything for me. You can define all of this all you want. You can define information architecture, but if you don't communicate what it is and how it works, it doesn't do anyone any good. You can define governance, but if you don't have any enforcement, it's just a suggestion. So you have to consider, what am I defining here in this circle? And then how am I enforcing it? The definition of information architecture, the governance of where it can and cannot be, and then the actuality of end users just doing what they want because I've either not explained it to them or I've made it too complicated for them to be successful. So these are really the kinds of things you have to consider to wrap it all together. So if we look at information architecture, you need to define your perspective. How are you coming at this? If you're coming at this from a technical perspective, make sure that you bring people in from a business perspective to balance that. Then you need to identify what types of workspaces do you have, and how will they affect the use of the system. So you then align those workspaces to the controls and regulations that affect your organization. And then lastly, I cannot say this enough, review that with business in mind. One of my favorite stories about that is a friend of mine in the Virginia area. She created her SharePoint intranet, or the design of her intranet. She designed the navigation, and she sat down to test that with the users, thankfully in a UAT environment and not in a production environment. And she very quickly realized that the way she defined terms was not the same way or the users defined terms. And so she said, quick, go find this item, go find the accounting department in our navigation. And they couldn't. And so she turned this test into a card sorting exercise, where they were able to define the navigation that made sense to the end users without changing the architecture and the physical structure of the content. So approach what you've designed with the business in mind. On the governance side, you need to determine the principles and goals of your governance structure and for your organization. You need to identify the supporting services that are available to you, from the end user service, Teams and SharePoint, to the security side, the compliance side, the e-discovery center. Know what your license enables for you. And then you need to assemble your teams, and that's a lowercase t. So I don't mean assemble Microsoft Teams. I mean assemble your stakeholder groups. Define your governance board. Define your information architecture board, your change board. You need to bring these people together. You need to define, if you're a big firm, what's the rotation for people in our information architecture committee? What's the rotation for people in our governance board? And lastly, you need to develop an education strategy, because simply rolling the tools out and rolling these plans out is not enough. People are not going to be successful if you don't not just once tell them about it, but continue over time to educate. And on that point, you need to develop an ongoing plan for both of these areas to make sure that as the organization changes, you can modify your IA. As the requirements change and the regulations change, you can modify your governance. So you have to have that ongoing plan to do so. So with that in mind, thank you, everybody. It is 51 minutes past the hour, and many of you have been on for a very long day. If you have any questions, I'm happy to stay on, answer questions in the chat, or if you want to ping me on LinkedIn or on Twitter, these are my usernames there. And I very much look forward to your comments. And honestly, if I got something wrong, please let me know, maybe a little privately, but please let me know, because I want to make sure that I'm representing this correct to my customers and to the community so that they can be successful. And hopefully, I learned through this, and hopefully you learned something as well. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jay. It was very helpful.
It's my pleasure.
Thanks, Jay, for the wonderful call. I wanted to ask you a personal question. Like, if somebody wants to really go in as a IA, this architect role, do we also need to know the real business domain? Like, if I'm working on an insurance industry or retail industry, we need to be expert in that area also, apart from the technical skills.
Yeah, that's a great question. My answer is no. It always helps because it helps you understand the perspective that you're trying to solve problems for. But technically, and this is when I come across a lot, a records manager is never going to be a SharePoint expert. And a SharePoint administrator is never going to understand all of the rules and regulations that affect records. There's a partnership that has to be inherent within an organization for those two roles to be successful. So in your case, your question's exactly the same. An information architect understands the relationships of data, but they may not necessarily understand the industry they're in. Does it help? Yes. And that's why I highly recommend that from an organizational perspective, you're pairing your information architects with people who understand the space, not just the industry, but your organization as well.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Thank you for asking. Well, again, thank you, everybody. And have a great night. For those of you who are past midnight, please have a wonderful rest and enjoy the remainder of the weekend.
Yeah, thank you. I will stop the recording now.
Thank you, Kamlesh.